Welcome to our webinar today called Sharing the Kettle. So this is, and welcome to our speakers, to our panel. What I wanted to do today is we're going to have this Sharing the Kettle webinar, and I wanted, just because I know that some of our audience is from outside the Columbia Basin, and the Columbia Basin Watershed Network is a network of watershed stewardship organizations inside the Columbia Basin. And so we partner with, well, our network members are watershed stewardship groups, and we work to make their connections to local governments more effective, because there is no mandated system of local or even provincial watershed planning in the province. And so it takes place quite differently in different local jurisdictions, and the issues are different. But what I find interesting about the Kettle River Management Plan, and the reason that I've invited this group to speak today, is that to me it offers some possibility to just see how does a local government get involved with watershed planning, and how does that happen? What are the activities that you guys are doing, and how do you bring this all about and make it happen? And there's quite a few local governments in the Columbia Basin that do some part of watershed planning, either through drinking water planning or in the Lake Windermere, Columbia Valley area. There's some local government involvement in some different kind of lake usage issues. And we've been working on a multi-government institution on Kootenay Lake to work with federal, provincial, different government jurisdictions on Kootenay Lake. So there are lots of different models out there, and what I wanted to do today is learn a little bit more about this particular model and how this came about. So we're bringing together today Graham Watt from the City of Grand Forks, Roly from the Regional District of Kootenay Boundary, and Jessica Mace from the Kettle River Authority to talk to us. A few things before we begin. If you do have any connection issues, like if you get cut off, if you could just use the same link you got to register and connect back in. The attendees right now are on a blanket mute, and that means that we can't hear you when you talk. So if you can use it's actually the question and answer box to put questions in as you go along. And then at the end, we'll have a question period, and I'll very likely, if you have a question, what I'll probably do is make it so that you can be heard, and then we'll have questions and answers. So again, here's our speakers today. Graham Watt is a land use, watershed, and environmental planner with municipal and not-for-profit experience. He is currently senior planner of the City of Grand Forks, previously served as the project coordinator for Kettle River Watershed Management Plan with the Regional District of Kootenay Boundary, and the basin planner for the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance. Roly's been working with societal sustainability, decision-making, and ecology for 15 years. He spent time as a researcher, a farmer, and a politician. And currently he lives on a small farm with his family in rural Grand Forks and serves as the electoral area director for Regional District Kootenay Boundary, as well as a director for the Grand Forks Credit Union. And he's currently board chair of the Regional District of Kootenay Boundary. And Jessica is coordinator for the Kettle River Watershed Authority. So welcome again, you guys. And I have a quick poll for the attendees, and what I'd like to do is you guys should be able to, on your screens when you're calling in, you can use your own screen and answer where you're calling in from today, And does your local government participate in watershed planning? So the attendees have those options. Good, it's working. We got one answer.
Hi, Rick.
So we've got, when we have a few more votes, I can just report on where people are calling in from. We're getting close here. So I'll just go ahead and, oh, there's a couple of, okay, couple of chat box entries. So the half the attendees are from the West Kootenay. We have one person calling in from the North Columbia region. Third are from outside of the Columbia Basin, elsewhere in BC, and one person from outside of British Columbia. And in terms of watershed planning, 2/3 the local government has adopted a watershed plan. Half is our local, about half our local government provides for drinking water, but does not tie land use to water. And then one each of our local government relies on water quality for drinking and recreation, but leaves management to other levels of government, and one don't know. So that gives us an idea of who's calling in. Also, and just the chat entries instead of the polls. Rick Simpson, excuse me, from Kelowna, and Nelson Chattel just said he's calling in from the Okanagan. So what I want to do today is, or what I want to do right now is switch the presentation over to, sorry you guys, smoothly switch the presentation over to Roly's computer. So Roly, you should, there we are already, awesome. And with that, I'll let you guys start your presentation.
Sounds good. And we're gonna shut the camera off at this point too, so for the video sharing for bandwidth issues.
Okay, here we go.
Okay. All right. Hopefully that works from there. There we go. All right. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. So as we said before, I'm Graham. I work at the City of Grand Forks as a senior planner. I was involved from fairly early on in the Kettle River Watershed Management Plan and wanted to provide a short overview kind of on the 10,000-foot view of the process as a bit of a place to talk about the some of the particular issues that came up in our planning process and how they might apply to other local governments getting involved in watershed planning. Roly has been involved since near the beginning, came on as electoral area director just about 1 year into the process, I guess, after the technical plan was well underway and we were starting into the management planning. And then Jessica Mace joined in 2015, 16, 15? Yeah, 2015, as I was moving from my role, beginning of 16, yeah. So as I was moving from my role with the regional district on the Kettle River plan to being a planner at the city. So starting with the big picture, first of all, the background, this is the Johnson Flats wetland protected area in Grand Forks, and it's one of our first nature parks that was dedicated. It's part of an oxbow wetland that's intimately connected to the river, Kettle River. It's fed by groundwater that passes through the river and then flows back out in a small stream. So it's kind of a neat, a microcosm of the larger watershed and one of the most special and unique wetland areas that we've got in our valley. So yeah, it's kind of a neat place to start. The beginning of the watershed planning process, I've been a part of a few of them, a couple in the central part of Alberta, Vermilion River Watershed Management Plan, North Saskatchewan Watershed Management Plan, and a little bit on the Sturgeon and kind of heartland central reach of the North Saskatchewan before coming to BC and working on the Kettle. So often these processes are brought about because of a really big political issue that affects hydrology, affects the fisheries, affects water supply. And as we get down into the watershed planning process, often we should go back and see how our understanding of that original trigger has changed during the studies and planning scoping work, and then we come back to the trigger as we go into implementation and see how we are addressing that initial view. So in the 2000s, we had several years of severe drought and low flows. There was certainly some 1 in 50, 1 in 100 year type low flows that were happening. You could walk across the Kettle in late summer, and the trout fishery really took a severe turn. I know Rick Simpson has a long history on that he can comment on. There was also at that time a hydro development proposal, a run of the river proposal. There had been a uranium mining proposal that didn't go ahead. There was the endangered river status from the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC that kind of heightened the political awareness about the issue. And there was amazing amount of uncertainty about actually how much water is available and how much do we use. So kind of the classical water supply and demand study interacting with the ecosystem was kind of one of the first things that came to mind to people is how much water do we have and who's using it and how does that affect the resource. So from that initial trigger, the second step in a lot of these processes that some government or partnership or NGO, someone with some kind of authority provides a mandate to actually go forward and plan and come up with some recommendations and do things. And quite often this is what's missing when plans don't actually get started or go anywhere, because there's no one to say that, yeah, we need the funding to make this happen and we're going to listen to the results. So the mandate is really the formalization of the governance at the very beginning. And in the case of the Kettle River, there was a steering committee that was established right away, composed of the elected officials, directors for the boundary part of the regional district Kootenay boundary, so that 3 municipalities, the city of Grand Forks, the village of Midway and city of Greenwood, as well as electoral area C, Christine Lake, D on rural Grand Forks, and E west boundary. So that's kind of half of or more than half of the geographic area of the regional district, but less than half of the population. Lots of watershed issues that are distinct in the Kettle part of the regional district from the Columbia side, which is the Trail and Rossland area, electoral areas A and B. And so it was definitely kind of something that came about from the interest, the strong engagement and interest that the directors in particular felt that we needed to study this. We need to look at what are the issues within the watershed and how does the water use and demand water supply and demand actually roll out. So they established a technical advisory committee to help scope the issue, from that came a phase 1 watershed study. Summit Environmental came in and basically looked at all the hydrology, all the water licenses, surfacing groundwater. It was definitely a water supply type study first overall. It didn't have the full, I'm going to go forward a slide just to take us to that, and then I might jump back in. Jumping into hydrological assessment, it was really focused on those questions of water supply and demand. The second phase was identified in the mandate was to develop a watershed plan and then go forward into implementation. Briefly, we'll talk more about funding later, but there was a good understanding about what the gas tax could be used for, especially with regards to capacity building and studies that could relate to things like water conservation, water supply, source water protection, that kind of thing. So there was a really good I think understanding that phase 1 and phase 2 could have gas tax funding going into it. So I think the original phase 1 study was about $100,000, maybe 110 or something like that, plus quite a bit of in-kind from the technical advisory committee. And the phase 2, so that first one took about a year. Phase 2 took about 3 years and was 200,000 about. So basically that whole 1 and 2 is about 300 altogether. It was conducted basically as a contract. So phase 1 was a contracted watershed study, and then phase 2 was a contracted coordinator hosted by the regional district and living in the watershed, as opposed to a consulting firm coming from the outside to do that work. And then phase 3 implementation has been the same way, coordinators with a local group, basically directly contracted by the local government through the steering committee and the RDKB. So on the assessment, I talked about phase 1. I'll talk a bit more about the discussion papers when we get to the planning piece, but we filled some of the information gaps about future climate conditions, about threats to riparian areas during the planning phase. So because the phase 1 study was so focused on hydrological conditions, water supply, water use, and kind of constraints to fisheries, there was less information available on wetland conditions, riparian conditions, and some of the other land use effects that affected watershed planning. So some of those pieces were undertaken during the planning phase. We did 5, well, here I'll get into the actual plan piece. We had during the planning phase, phase 2, we had a steering committee, same from the regional district and municipal directors, stakeholder advisory group, which was, how many did we have on there? Probably 20?
Yeah, 20 something, 25. Maybe.
Yeah, 25 stakeholders from across the normal, government groups, non-governmental organizations, different resource sectors were represented. Sometimes incompletely. We can talk more about that later, I think. But what kicked it off was a watershed-wide survey that went out to every address in the watershed, which is about 8,000, 9,000 households, something like that. And we got 800 returns on that, which is the 10% return. I was pretty happy with it. People were engaged in the issue because of the triggers that were felt and a lot of concern about them. So we had a lot of really good input at the very beginning about what people saw as the main issues, what they wanted to see out of the watershed. So we really focused on trying to understand what people's understanding were of the constraints and issues, and then bring that into the, as well as a series of meetings that were held early on. The first of 5 discussion papers was a vision for the Kettle River watershed, and that looked, what was the input from the survey and stakeholder meetings, and what were the main issues that should be addressed based on that information, and what were the pieces that we had information that was ready to bring forward from the phase 1 study. And then we had a discussion paper focused on governance and capacity. We had one looking at water supply, climate change, drought. So that was the discussion paper 3. Discussion paper 4 was on water quality, source water protection, water quality objectives and those pieces. And number 5 was on the riparian and floodplain kind of issues. So we usually would have a stakeholder meeting associated with every discussion paper, get feedback on the scoping of the issues and the draft recommendations in that discussion paper, and then wrapped it all together into a watershed management plan that, because of all the depth within those discussion papers, we managed to keep relatively short, like 35, 40 pages or something.
At the most.
At the most.
Yeah.
Something to keep, small and focused. And in that watershed plan, we sifted through all of those recommendations for a couple of years and came up with several key areas, kind of overarching recommendations, and then 59 actions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and each of the actions identified the governance and stakeholder piece that was relevant, who who would lead and who would have an interest in it. So it tried to bring it back to who has the authority to actually carry out this action. And that kind of pointed us towards what would be involved in the implementation. So the plan came out, one of the first topics was to address the governance issues and look at how we would actually be able to carry out implementation. We did a couple initial projects in 2015 and then passed on leadership to Jess. And during that time, there was a really great discussion about how this is going to work as we move into implementation. And I think maybe I'll pass it over to Roly and Jess next about how that all came about and where we're at now.
Sure. And I would also, maybe just before we move on, that plan piece that Graham talked about, I see that as essentially the framework of that arrangement of having discussion papers with the bulk of the material in them, and then having a very succinct plan document. I think that was predominantly Graham's brainchild, and I think that has been a very valuable piece for us moving forward, because it means that plan itself is not a big stack of paper that we're bringing out whenever we're going back and touching base with our plan. So in public meetings and so on, that's proved to be a very valuable strategy, I think. In terms of implementation, I mean, one of the things that, let me just see if we can flip over to a different graphic here. One of the things that we spent a great deal of time talking about is how do we deliver this? Now we've got a plan and we're trying to implement it. How do we set up the governance structure for that implementation in a way that's productive and valuable? And this is a very busy page.
We're busy.
And yet I think it does a great deal to kind of demonstrate what we've come up with, which is part of our kind of value of this whole implementation stage of the project. And so the white boxes along the bottom there represent the working group. So we have focal kind of groups that come together around specific topics. So we have a group, for example, that represents all the water suppliers, and that way we're getting good value out of their time that they dedicate to the process to come up with a set of recommendations, for example, that would then go to the greater table, which is the Watershed Authority table, which is kind of what that Watershed Authority table is what evolved out of that stakeholder advisory group that Graham was mentioning earlier. And so this Watershed Authority table represents a large group of people across different sectors and different interests. They come together and try to come to consensus on making recommendations to whatever decision makers are out there that we think are appropriate to direct those decisions or direct those recommendations to. And so that on the left there, you see that kind of yellow hue stack that says decision-making groups. That's the intended outcome of the Watershed Authority, is to provide recommendations and good decision-making advice to those groups. And so the obvious one would be local government, because local government is pretty deeply involved in the process, but it goes well beyond that as well. And I think that's part of again, the real value of the current state of our implementation is that ability to make those recommendations. And we're just getting into, I think, making those recommendations beyond the immediate local government. And this probably is a good time to tangent into a little bit into the term authority. And so we call ourselves the Kettle River Watershed Authority, and there was a lot of debate over whether that was okay to call ourselves the authority, because people would say, well, you don't have the authority to tax and so on because you represent this broader group. And the reality is that there's another interpretation or definition of authority that has to do with the ability to influence decisions. And so we struggled with it for quite a while, and we settled on that term. And I think that has been a good decision in terms of, the role that we see that this group plays in implementing that plan is is quite broad, and that's really the targeted role. It's the ability to influence those decisions. And so that's what, you know, happy to come back to that in the questions later if people want, but I think that's been a good choice. Off to the right there, you see a round table. So we recognize that we needed an opportunity for the community in general to have a regular, if not frequent, but a regular chance to be able to weigh in on the plan and how we're doing, and or just present issues that matter to them in the watershed. And so that's the round table provides that opportunity. Anybody can come get an update on where we're at, as well as provide more input. So the little purple arrow shows back into the authority, so the authority can take that information and craft that into a recommendation. The big blue box in the background, that's Jessica. So that represents, you know, the background for all of this is essentially being supported by the kind of foundational work and the coordination work that is done by our plan coordinator, who was Graham initially, now is Jessica. And then up in the upper left there is the steering committee, and that represents, you know, that's the elected officials, somewhat intentionally meant to be, as I'm one of them, I'm allowed to say this, so somewhat intentionally meant to be off to the side and not to take a dominant and central role in the guidance of this process, because we want it to be more of a community-driven outcome in terms of this governance structure. So that would be that's the summary of that piece. In terms of the implementation, let's maybe go back to that other screen. Just hang on one sec. So in terms of implementation, in a more detailed sense, I might turn it over to Jessica and let her speak to that a little bit. I will just maybe identify as well the last point there, the funding and implementation challenges. I mean, one of the issues that we have struggled with is how do we establish a sustainable funding model for the watershed, implementation of this watershed authority and the implementation of our watershed management plan. And that as I'm sure many of you are experienced with, is a challenge. And so we've been struggling with that. Right now, we're very project focused because we have an avenue to fund projects, and we're trying to figure out, get a better line of sight on what that longer term, what does this look like in 2 to 3 years? And that's where that's some political conversation at the local government level, trying to identify whether we need to adapt an existing service to provide opportunity to support this, create a new service, as well as we've initiated conversations with the province to try to establish what their role might be in helping us deliver this, given that part of what we're trying to accomplish serves their mandate as well. So with that, I'll maybe turn it over to Jessica, who's, as I say, most deeply involved in our current implementation challenges.
Okay, so I'll just speak briefly about what we're working on and what we've kind of worked on in the past year. As these guys mentioned, when I first got on, I spent most of my time working on the governance piece of it. And then, of course, we had this large authority group that somebody had to get organized. So I spent a lot of time talking to people and getting people at that table. And people generally seem keen, and we have such a wide range of people there, you know, from ranchers to tree nursery owners, the guys from the logging industry, environmental groups, you know. So I think it's going in the right direction. It's just takes a lot of effort, of course, to get all those people together. And the other thing we focused on really is public education. We've been at, we have a booth, you know, we set up at fairs, and we worked with some school groups, and even a group of, we were able to meet with teachers, which that seems to be effective. And then another piece that we've worked on and will continue working on is their well licensing workshops. So this is part of the Water Sustainability Act that all groundwater users have to non-domestic groundwater users have to apply for a license with the provincial government. I'm sure you guys mostly know about that. But that, you know, there's a lack of, there's a lot of people here that don't even have computers, don't know how to use computers, and so we've tried to reach out and help those people get, actually go through the process and apply for their license. And then something great that happened was the provincial government was working with us on that, and they are now going to provide us with a bit of funding to do more workshops over this next year. It's in the form of a grant, so I guess that's one way that they can provide a little bit of funding for us. It's $10,000 for the year, but of course, you know, that's not every year. We'd love to have something every year and have more sustainable funding, but you know, it's something, so that's great. And then the big piece that we are working on now is a drought management plan. So that's working with, you know, all the water suppliers in the area. We have the municipal water suppliers, and even the regional district supplies water at Christina Lake. And then we have a bunch of independent water suppliers here. And so we're trying to work with all those people to come up with, you know, different drought triggers, get a real understanding of what's happening here, make sure, you know, we're all on the same page. And we're working closely with the provincial government to make sure we do it in a way that they will respect us, and they will, you know, use the information that we provide, and also use us to, you know, what's the right word, disseminate information to the people that live here and that are impacted by droughts. Anything else we're working on?
Maybe some of the connections with the riparian groups, so Jenny's work with Habitat,
yes.
There's parts of our network are doing work that arose out of the watershed planning process and is part of implementation.
Yeah. Yes, that's a very good point. And so it's a group called the Boundary Habitat Stewards that we are a part of, and it's basically the Granby Wilderness Society, the Boundary Invasive Species Society, and the Christina Lake Stewardship Society work across the boundary to do the restoration work in like various areas of the watershed. And yeah, and just what Graham said, that was, you know, came out of probably the surveys and people saying how, you know, much damage they see to the riparian areas.
And the riparian threat assessment was a big part of it.
Yeah.
Jenny and I worked on there. So,
yeah. That was a big piece of work, the riparian threat assessment.
Big project.
Yeah.
Which speaks to, I think, some of the, you know, part of the triggers that Graham mentioned initially that got us to this point where we're in reality that those kind of cumulative impacts of different water uses and impacts on water, especially whether it's power or agricultural use and so on, and trying to get a better grasp on how they work together. And so one of the outcomes was the commissioning of a report that looked at those riparian threats and tried to do a better job of understanding what the combination of different threats on our landscape and our watershed have, and can we identify where areas are particularly at risk or not, which is one of the other, you know, still another piece that came out of this project.
That pretty much sums up what we wanted to get to with the presentation. So maybe should we hand it back to Tara to do the Q&A?
Sure thing. I'm just unmuting myself here. And since I'm since I'm in charge of the buttons, I guess I get to ask the first questions. But I think just so that you know, if you're attending, you can raise your hand or you can write a question in the question and answer box. I guess just for my first question, Jessica, when you're talking about the initial projects, sorry, I'm just going to grab the screen back. When you were talking about the initial projects, you were talking about some information dissemination and work with groups across. Are there any other sort of project-based funding that the authority is leading, or are you working with that Habitat? How are you doing some of those? What are the projects exactly?
Well, the biggest project right now is the drought management plan, and that is being funded through gas tax. From mainly, well, all from the regional district.
And what are some of the elements of that? How does that work?
Yeah, sorry, I'll just mention the other funding that we got. These guys just reminded me is we got some money from the community forest. Here, they have to spend a certain amount of money on community projects, and of course, they're in the watershed, so they provided us with money. And then we also got funding from the individual water suppliers here, municipal and also independent, which I think is great because it showed, their buy-in. It wasn't like a ton of money from a lot of them, but it shows that they were interested, they see the value, and then they, put the money behind it to help fund the work. So that was great.
Infrastructure planning grant too, did you get that as well?
Yes, and then the infrastructure planning grant from the provincial government as well, which was great, and that was close to $10,000. So that's super helpful.
I think to speak to what the project entails, one of the pieces that comes up regularly is drought management or water use management tied to drought. And so one of the things that was identified from those early those working groups in the bottom of that slide we had earlier, the water suppliers working group, clearly there's some value for those water suppliers in having a coordinated drought response. And so trying to figure out how to craft that in a way that was applicable to a large municipal water supplier, such as the City of Grand Forks, as well as some of the smaller improvement district water systems, for example, or less formal water systems where there's only a handful of users. And so the City of Grand Forks, for example, has a very well evolved and established communication system and everything around their drought response. But other water suppliers didn't. And so being able, for example, to have a kind of flexible model that we could provide value to those that needed it on those sorts of issues and not meddle with the larger players that maybe don't need help in communication. But then at the same time helping communicate. So for example, we would get the provincial flood stage would be or drought stage is different from the City of Grand Forks' flood level and so on, or drought level, sorry. We're getting into flood season. Yeah. So
both last year.
Yeah. So being able to do a better job, for example, of just communicating to people in the watershed, to be able to say, this is the level of drought that we're at this point, and recognize that different water suppliers might implement response measures differently, but it would be really valuable if there was coordination across those responses to a set of triggers that people recognize as kind of somewhat universally applicable or across the watershed. And so that's part of the challenge there, is that flexible model of what a drought response plan would look like for us.
Yeah, that's a great example. Actually, another example of a project that is, I think it's early days yet to see how it's going to roll out. But one of the recommendations of the Watershed Plan is that local governments, regional district, and the province work on updating the floodplain map. And because of all the flooding last year, there's been a tremendous flush of funding come through, and we're usually, though, it's kind of at the local government level that's really pushing the coordination of this work. It's not coordinated provincially as the last round of floodplain mapping was in the 1990s. But the Kettle River Watershed Authority has a kind of a unique role with its capacity for connecting with all of the key stakeholders being involved in communications, and it has that aspect of authority of having all the many different little decisions that impact and are impacted by floods. And so in 2 different floodplain projects, it looks like the scope of the project will be, at least in the proposals, to include the Kettle River Watershed Authority having a role in stakeholder engagement. We're, I believe, Midway's looking at that model, and Grand Forks is also looking at that. Ours, we received funding for updating ours, and we work closely with Area D and the Watershed Authority to connect with all the stakeholders that need to be there, especially when we look at the flood hazard assessment and the implications for floodplain bylaws and local planning bylaws that we're always involved in implementing at the local government level. There's a lot of issues that came about last year during the floods, where the Watershed Authority folks were actually out there on the ground connecting with people, while the Emergency Operations Center folks were kind of doing all the official stuff, and it wasn't perfectly aligned. But we saw the opportunity after to say, let's get more connected before the next emergency to have some of the big picture connections working well.
I guess in terms of those 2, the flood and the drought, I'm wondering, have you been able to fund have you found some sources for sort of green infrastructure kinds of projects, which is I think Graham and I have talked about this before, but using the ecological services model for some of your flood and drought kinds of management? Have you been able to find funding for those kinds of things?
I'll start with Grand Forks. So we were one of the 5 member municipalities for the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, and we were originally looking at the stormwater function of a large wetland complex in the city and how that benefited the city's stormwater system as well as the receiving water in the Kettle River. Given that we weren't actually looking at removing any kind of protection from that wetland complex, and then we had the floods come along last year, we actually switched gears to have working with the overall pilot project with the David Suzuki Foundation, various partners, to look at the trade-offs of floodplain development and structural flood protection on the one hand versus floodplain function and capacity of the floodplain hydrologically to buffer floods. So this is always the big question that comes about is, as you develop and protect the floodplain, you're also then losing watershed function. So through the modeling capacity that was available with MNAI, we were able to get some preliminary results kind of within the city of Grand Forks core area where we had LiDAR data available. And it actually turns out to be quite significant. If you allow development out closer to the river's edge and then put your structural flood protection, your dikes and that kind of thing against the water's edge just inside of high water mark as it's done typically, versus setting them back at least 30 meters, if not further, you're giving the river room to breathe. And depending on how far back that structural flood protection goes, you'll actually see decreases in flood peak levels. And we didn't have the chance to test overland flow velocities with this model, but because of the initial, I would call it kind of big what if, because our input data wasn't good enough, but because of the results of that big what if type modeling work that happened, we're actually feeding those impacts directly into our floodplain hazard assessment. And when we get into the modeling, we'll be looking at a broader river reach section that actually incorporates these floodplain function, floodplain development trade-offs. So when we can actually look at to what degree the floodplain provides flood attenuation as well as other ecological benefits like groundwater infiltration and water treatment, water quality improvement, we'll actually be able to hopefully address those and bring them directly into our planning documents. The other piece that Grand Forks is doing as a result of this focus on natural assets and green infrastructure is started as part of our capital projects funding. It's small this year, it's only $25,000 this year, but going to $50,000 next year, where we're looking for an opportunity with every capital project to incorporate a green infrastructure component. So that might be instead of running stormwater sorry, I dropped my pen. Instead of running stormwater off the street directly into a catch basin into a stormwater network, we're now looking at potential for a bioswale and cell-to-cell like tree irrigation component from it. So we're, trying to get more runoff attenuation and water quality improvement before it goes into our stormwater system. So we're going to be looking for opportunities with every capital project kind of to do it on the municipal end at the same time as writing some standards into our subdivision development servicing bylaw and other development processes, so that green infrastructure is considered at the development stage, where you're working on grading, where you're working on connections to storm sewer, when you're dealing with water table issues and that kind of piece. So we're definitely taking it to heart and still have quite a bit of work to do to get, what are the best management practices that apply most within the city of Grand Forks. But we definitely will be sharing those with the other local governments for their own work going forward.
Okay. What I'd like to do is, Rick Simpson has a few comments. For those of you, for the rest of you on the webinar, Rick is, where's my command thing? Rick is on the steering committee, and so I'm trying to figure out how to make it so he can talk. Maybe I'll just read his comments out. I'm getting confused by my mouse here. So Rick Simpson's on the steering committee for the Watershed Authority. I hope I have the name of that right, in that complex organization. And he just wants to talk about what are some of the elements for success. So it was really, he mentions that you need the buy-in by the taxpayers. There's the importance of having the fully engaged leadership, including, he mentions Roly, who was a champion, making the plan and its implementation priorities really visible, having a paid watershed coordinator for continuity of effort, and avoiding that piecemeal project funding. And it's really important, and he mentions it a few times, to learn from the work and experiences of other watershed groups. And I think he's talking about the experience that you guys are bringing from your other watershed work, I think, there. So that's just comments. And Kat has a question, which I'll just read out. Kat Hartwig, how are you managing the input of the community-based water monitoring? So, for example, maybe in determining priority monitoring areas for water quality, and then how do you house the data? Or do you have an open source water data hub? And are there any bottlenecks with data sets being implemented into policy? So what is your monitoring? Let's start with, what is your monitoring set, and what's the community-based role in that?
Go ahead. Yeah, sure. So we identified this as a priority area to get into for water quality management, and the role of community groups in being able to provide input. Currently, the water quality data is not something that's been able to be moved on, other than continuing community involvement out at Christina Lake, which is fed directly to the provincial limnologists. And basically the limnologists and those that deal with water quality, administrative environment and fisheries and that kind of thing do take the data that's collected at our, we have a federal provincial water quality monitoring agreement at, so the Kettle River is sampled regularly at Midway and upstream of Grand Forks. And then there's various different pieces of water quality that are generally obtained upstream and downstream of the outfalls for our municipal discharges. And then in addition, on the American side of the kettle, that's actually something we didn't even get to. Yeah. We're international watershed here, and have the river flows into the States and back into Canada, then into the States again. They have a tremendous amount of water quality data through Washington State Department of Ecology, as well as various community groups that are down there. There is no coherent water quality database. There are no water quality objectives that are set specifically to different areas of the watershed. It's not there yet. And I think it's a combination of capacity at the local level has not been developed in terms of our watershed stewards have not been focusing on, you know, getting their up to date on the water quality piece other than Christina Lake. And then likewise, there isn't capacity at the at the provincial level to be investing a lot of time into developing water quality programs that, you know, look more comprehensively than a couple of sampling points. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
I was just going to add also, so part of the question is about determining those priority monitoring areas. And as Graham pointed out, like we I think have been very careful about recognizing the limitations on our capacity, because we don't want to be overtaxing or taking on projects that we can't deliver on. And so that's a good example, that prioritization piece. Like, for example, with the monitoring networks that Graham spoke to, we as that Watershed Authority came to a consensus that we wanted to say, to request that we see another monitoring well in groundwater monitoring well in Midway, and then took that request to the regional district. That request then went to the province. And I think in part because of the diverse group that is supporting that recommendation, that eventually came to be. And so that's part of the way in which we see this to serve, right, is bringing together a bunch of diverse stakeholders, and if we can get them to come to consensus and make a recommendation about something, then that goes to decision maker, in that case, the local government, and in turn, basically, indirectly to the provincial government, and we saw that happen. And then that data, we're not in a place where we have the capacity to manage that data, but it's better at the provincial level anyway in that case.
All I was going to say was that the provincial guys that do work on monitoring, they call us every once in a while and ask us to go and do the odd thing for them. And, you know, when the drought came in, they wanted us to go take photographs for them. So we've done a bit of that work, but they're not providing, you know, we don't have the funding to do that work. And they are talking about it amongst themselves, which is encouraging. And I still like hoping that they'll call us up one day and say, yeah, we're going to fund you to do that work. Anyway, yeah.
A question from Rick for Roly. What do you see as the Kettle River Watershed Management Authority top 3 priorities? And he's named one, which would be including getting you reelected.
All right, well, that's good, because I appreciate only having to come up with 2. So, thanks, Rick. You know, your comment about learning from other examples elsewhere. You know, the Minister for Housing and Municipal Affairs, Lena Robinson, was speaking a couple of weeks ago to us at an event, and she was talking about housing hubs and the notion that they've recognized, the provincial government has recognized, that there's a huge amount of capacity in our communities across the province to deliver on housing needs, right? Housing and poverty and that big sticky problem. But there's a lack of coordination or capacity in these communities to coordinate how to deliver on those multifaceted problems. And so, you know, and it's maybe higher level than you're asking for, Rick, but that to me is the biggest, I think, priority, is to be able to deliver on that notion that we can take a watershed and all the associated issues associated with that system, and be able to play an effective role in coordinating and leveraging the capacity that exists out there, whether that capacity is in our local government, whether it's in our environmental groups or in our forest industry. There's a huge amount of energy, but a little bit of work on coordinating, I think, can accomplish a lot of return. And so that's probably the #1 priority.
And if I can add one thing to that, this comes back to that mandate question that we addressed at the beginning of the presentation, is that I was reflecting on when I first came to BC, I presented on watershed planning in Alberta, and the question of mandate was very clear. It was a province-wide, or southern Alberta basically, wide issue with drought that triggered a huge amount of provincial water policy development. And they presented a province-wide mandate for these intergovernmental NGO partnerships, watershed planning and advisory committees, to go forth and assess, plan, bring back recommendations to implement. So it essentially they established that they're not decision makers, they're not binding, but they presented a mandate to go forth and do this. And then those local networks, local capacity was brought into these processes. And with that, not having that in BC, we get a lot of diversity in our different watershed processes about how they come about. I'd love to see way more provincial level clarity and coordination and support for those partnerships.
One thing that is a slight sideline, but it frustrates me as an elected local government official when we hear the comment that we do hear fairly regularly that it's outside of our core services or outside of our mandate as local government to take on these sticky problems, because the reality is our mandate is to improve quality of life. That's our purpose as defined by legislation. And so I think, we have capacity, that we don't necessarily have capacity. We have the authority, basically, that we have the responsibility to deliver that. It's a question of how, as Graham's saying, how do we engage that opportunity more effectively? And so provincial direction would certainly help on that front. The other piece, I guess, that I would say is a priority, which I think Rick would appreciate, is the sustainable funding. And so we've been struggling a lot in terms of do we go out for a referendum at the same time we're going into an election to ask for support for this sort of thing? Do we try to reorganize existing services to provide funding? And what does the provincial involvement look like? And we have opened that conversation with the minister, the past minister, and the current minister of Forest Lands, Natural Resource, and Rural Development. And so that's a big piece, is what does the provincial role, for example, look like in this? And it's not necessarily funding even, it could be capacity support somehow, but what does that look like from our perspective, from our taxpayers' perspective, and from the provincial involvement perspective?
Well, I'd like to thank all of the panelists today and the people who attended and asked questions. I want to just recommend the website for those of you that haven't visited. It's an interesting website. It has a lot of good stuff on there. And what I will do is, if you have questions, I'll probably just pass them straight along to Jessica. But I thought initially the contact for questions could be me, and that's my email. And one thing I did want to say on the issue of sustainable funding is that our webinar coming up on the 25th of April, that's with Corey Tull and Megan Peloso. We'll be talking about some efforts the Canadian Freshwater Alliance is making to try to move forward on sustainable funding at the provincial level. So I invite you all to attend that one. And also thanks to the Columbia Basin Trust for making this series possible. And so thanks to everyone, and I'll be recording this and putting it up, and let me know if you have any questions, and thank you all very much. So
thank you, Tara.
Okay, thank you. It's 11:02. I figured I better end. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.